I know coming here isn't easy for anyone, but this support group is here to help you. And recent events like Brexit have stirred up a lot of feelings. And you've all come to realise something shocking. You've realised that not everyone thinks exactly the same as you do. Susan, maybe you'd like to share your story.
Thanks, Kay. Well, the thing is, I used to look at my Facebook and think, it's fine, we all basically agree with each other. And then, last June, the Brexit result, I gradually began to realise that there are people in the world who don't think the same as me.
Joseph, you had something to say.
Yeah, I went into work the day after the referendum, and some people were happy. And I realised, if people don't agree with me about that, maybe they don't agree with me about other things. I mean, some things we all agree on, like the Star Wars prequels, everyone thinks they're...
Oh, I quite like them.
Well, I don't think they're as bad as everyone says.
This can't be happening. What's the matter with you? Why can't everyone be right, like me?
Is this the place for the different opinion support group?
Yes, that's right. Please, come in.
I'm Frank.
Welcome, Frank. Now, remember, you can say anything you want here. It's a very safe environment.
Oh, great, thanks. It's got so I'm afraid to open my mouth in public. But, you know, it's not all doom and gloom, is it? I mean, happy anniversary.
Did you know? This might be shocking. Did you know there are people out there who don't think the way you do? There are people you will have disagreements with. Not everyone always lands on the same page. Not everybody sees life through the same lens. What happens when we live in a world, when we hang out with people, when we do church, and not everybody believes and thinks the way you do? I'm going to talk about that a little bit today, but first I thought I'd just introduce myself. My name's Jason, and I still really do work here. So, thanks for letting me take some weeks off to get the batteries recharged and spend some time with family. It's been an incredible few weeks. However, I also just want to take a moment and just welcome everybody who's online. We've been test driving live streaming for the last 2 weeks. We're going to continue to test drive it for the coming weeks to work all the kinks out, but we are very excited about what God is doing and excited about more and more engaging the culture. I want to thank Pastor Ben for leading that initiative and the entire tech team for all the work they do, even behind the scenes, just continuing to raise the bar and take us to the next level. I'm just so grateful for that. We also want to just give a big shout out today to our Colfax campus. They have at least 3 baptisms that they're going to be celebrating today, and we are excited about that. Yeah, we lift it up. They're doing church outdoors today, so I hope they keep cool on that. It's already warming up quickly, but we are so thankful from all that we're hearing that's going on out there. We're also looking forward to moving them from the elementary school into the high school there in Colfax here in September. A little bit larger facility, more modern, and the parking situation is a much better situation, so we are excited about that and making all the plans behind the scenes to get them relocated in that. We're looking for a worship leader out there. If you know somebody maybe who has a heart for rural America and can play an instrument really well and sing well, send them to our website to email us. We'd love to maybe talk to them a little bit. Celebrating Two Table Church, they were here last week, and just being able to partner with them. It's a big deal when you leave your city, leave your jobs, and go to a strange place because God has sent you there. In the old term, we call that burning the ships. You just kind of left it all behind and got here, and we are thankful to partner with them as they build momentum to launch probably this September, October as well in the Drake University area, and just continuing to see God multiply disciples, leaders, and churches here in the Des Moines area, because that is what it's all about here at Radiant. We are passionate about that, and that's what it is. That's what we do, and that's why we do it. Last, as part of that multiplying disciples and leaders, we're going to re-engage a conversation we started in January as well. We asked a question in January that's really important, and we're going to kind of revamp that again this fall and look at it under a magnifying glass and say, what was that question? That question was this: who's your one? Who's that one person that you are pouring into? Who is that person you are mentoring, that you are discipling, that you are building up? because it's all about disciples who make disciples who make disciples. That's how the early church grew, and that hasn't changed. That's how we grow. It is disciples who make disciples who make disciples. So more and more we're kind of re-engaging that conversation, re-looking at it. Pastor Luke is working on some mentoring relationships and a mentoring program behind the scenes, and we're really excited to have that unfold in the next couple months as we train some mentors and invite some people to start that conversation in their lives as well too. So there's all sorts of great things going on at Radiant Church. God is at work, God is on the move, and lives are being changed. We are celebrating that, and it's so wonderful to see, and thank you for letting me be your pastor and for being a part of this movement of God. What an honor and privilege. This idea, though, of equipping people isn't new. In fact, what a joy it has been in just the last few weeks to watch as Rich McCool had the privilege to teach, and last week Darren Waite had the privilege to teach, and they have done an amazing job. That is what we are about here at Radiant Church. It's about equipping and resourcing the people, the church, to do the works of service, to serve in the community, to serve here in the church. That is what it's about. It's about helping everyone understand their calling, their purpose. I believe God has uniquely equipped you in a special way to serve. In fact, what we say here at Radiant Church, if you call this your home and this is the movement that you are part of, we really expect everybody to serve here, not to be mean. We expect them to serve because there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And when God's people live on mission and have a passion to multiply disciples, leaders, and churches and get involved and are part of the process, I believe supernatural things can occur to a God where nothing is impossible. That is what it's all about at Radiant Church. Where do I get this idea of equipping and resourcing people, though? Where do I hear that from? Well, it can be in several places, but one character in particular, as we continue our yearbook series and looking at some of the heroes in the Bible, one in particular that stands out to me, man, he's a big hero in the Bible, and most of you have probably heard of him. It's the Apostle Paul. I love the Apostle Paul. This man was a multiplication machine. No matter where he went, he was multiplying disciples, leaders, and he planted churches all over the Roman Empire. Everywhere he went, it seems like he left leaders there who built churches, who then went out and built other churches and well. But Paul had this understanding that he was just one man, and there's no way that one man could do all of the work and accomplish everything God wants to accomplish. He was all about empowering leaders, but he understood what his role was. And I want to remind us of that as well, too. As he was talking to the church in Ephesus in Ephesians chapter 4, he had this to say to the church. He said, "So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors and teachers." What did he give them to do? To equip his people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up. Now, what is this verse saying? First thing we have to say is, well, what's the job, for instance, of the pastor or the teacher, such as I am? What is our primary job? And we see on there, it is to equip. Our primary purpose as a leader of the church is to equip and resource you. Now, who actually does the work is the next question. And this is the hard part, because according to Paul, it's you. According to Paul, it is Christ's people. It is the church. Keeping in mind, church is not a building. It's not a location. Church has always been the people of God. You are the church. So what is our job as pastors and leaders and teachers? Our job is to equip and resource you to do the works of service, to do what God uniquely called and equipped you to do. That's our primary goal. But I understand, being in ministry long enough, that this is something people really wrestle with sometimes. This is a difficult concept, and some, in fact, just don't even agree with it. They struggle with it. I mean, after all, didn't we hire you, pastor, to get the job done? Come on, pastor. Didn't we hire you to do the work? And this is true, especially in our consumer-driven culture. That's how we see it sometimes. But according to Paul, that's not how it's supposed to be done. See, according to Paul, the pastors and the teachers exist to equip others, to equip you to do the works. And so I realize right now, you may be disagreeing with Paul. And I think that's great, because guess what? A lot of people disagreed with Paul, not just on this, but a whole lot of things. What we learned about Paul is he was a pretty controversial guy. We learned about Paul that there were a lot of fights he got into. There were a lot of people he went toe-to-toe with. He wasn't afraid to confront things. And so we have a lot to learn from Paul today. Because the reality is, in our lives, in your lives, we're going to come across people we don't agree with. And they won't agree with you. How do we engage those conversations? How do we deal with those things? Because I think we like to think in the Bible in particular, we like to look at some of those early church fathers and some of the apostles and some of the disciples, like think, well, they were all really just one big happy family. They always agreed about everything. They just lovingly got along and made sure, hey, we've got to do this Jesus thing. But that's not what history tells us. History tells us just like any organization, just like any family, just like any group of people that come together, there were disputes. There were arguments. Not everybody always saw things the same way. They didn't always agree. In fact, I want to look real quick just to kind of highlight that a little bit. One area where Paul was having disagreements from people, and we see that in the book of Galatians, Galatians chapter 2 to be exact. In fact, the entire book of Galatians was Paul engaging a church trying to correct some things. Some things had slipped in, some different ideas had crept in, and he's trying to engage them, and he's trying to correct them. But there's one point where he says in Galatians 2, verse 11, he says, when Cephas, which is the Greek name for Peter, when Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. We'll get to that in a minute. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, even so much that by their hypocrisy, Barnabas was led astray. Now, right away, we're seeing three different people that Paul kind of had a rub with. Three people that he had a problem with right here. Well, who are those? Well, the first one is Peter. Peter's one of the original 12 disciples of Jesus. For 2 to 3 years, he did life with Jesus, and yet we've got Paul here condemning him to his face. Wow, that's pretty incredible. Well, what was he condemning him about? Well, the short story of this is Peter joined Paul in Antioch as Paul was preaching to the Gentiles, that's the non-Jews, and more of them were coming to have a saving relationship with Jesus Christ, and they were doing life together, eating together, whatever, just enjoying life together. But when some of Peter's Jewish friends showed up from Jerusalem, he backed away. Why? Because Jews did not eat with Gentiles. They believed Gentiles were unclean. It was improper. You didn't do that sort of thing. So when his friends showed up from Jerusalem, Peter stepped back from the Gentiles and would only eat with his Jewish friends. Well, Paul had a real problem with that. And he was calling them out. And he's like, no, you can't do that. That's not the way it's supposed to happen. In the gospel, there is no slave. There is no free. There is no male. There is no female. We are all one in Christ. Paul would teach that wherever he went. He did not allow for this sort of discrimination in this new life with Jesus Christ. So he's calling Peter out on him, and he should have, and we should continue to call that out today in our culture as well too. Who's this Barnabas character that he talks about in there? Well, Barnabas was somebody that went on missions trips with Paul. They would go on mission trips together where he would build leaders, multiply disciples and churches. On one of the trips, Barnabas brought along his cousin, John Mark. Now, the Bible doesn't talk about it a whole lot as to what happened, but somewhere along the way, John Mark packed his bags and went back home. On a later trip, Paul and Barnabas were planning, and Barnabas brought up again, hey, why don't we take John Mark on this trip? And Paul put his foot down and said, under no conditions, no, he's not going on a trip with me. And this caused a great dispute between the two of them, a really heated one, and which ended up being they both went their own separate ways, and there's no indication from Scripture they ever spoke again, just because of whatever this John Mark thing was going on. Third character we see in here is James. James is the half-brother of Jesus. He knew Jesus personally. James was in charge of the Jerusalem church. Sometimes people say, wait, I thought Peter is in charge of the Jerusalem church. No, history tells us actually James was in charge of the Jerusalem church. James theologically had some problems with Paul. We don't have time to go into all of them, but they did not agree on theological, religious issues, in particular because Paul was preaching to the Gentiles. And so what James was doing is he was sending representatives from the Jerusalem church, converted Jews who were Christians now, to where Paul was preaching. And Paul was constantly struggling with these people that were being sent by James. He called them Judaizers. And what were these Judaizers doing? Well, they were going into the towns where Paul was converting the Gentiles, and they were saying, hey, listen, it's great that you made a decision for Jesus, but you're not quite done yet. Not quite. You need to be wearing certain clothes, and you need to be observing certain festivals and holidays. You need to abstain from some particular foods. Oh, and by the way, you need to get circumcised, which would have raised my ears up a little bit on that one. It's like, hey, I appreciate you making a decision for Jesus, but you're not quite there yet. Well, this infuriated Paul, who believed wholeheartedly it is by faith alone and grace alone that we come to Jesus Christ. And he was constantly fighting with them. And this argument would eventually come to a head where we have what's called the Jerusalem Council in about 50 AD. Peter was there, James was there, Paul was there, and they were fighting out this idea of what do we do with these new Gentile believers? And they finally all agreed with Paul for the most part and said, we want to keep the yoke easy on the Gentiles coming to know Christ, with some stipulations, and they sent Paul on his way. But that would not be the end of the tension between James and Paul. They would seem to go at it the rest of their lives. Paul would continue to just preach, it is by grace alone, by faith alone, that we come to Jesus Christ. And yet we would see James over and over again and say, faith without works is dead. And for many folks, they still kind of wrestle with that tension between faith and works today. And so as is true 2,000 years ago, as is true today, as is true with any organization, as is true with even this church, there are disagreements. There are times where people don't see eye to eye, where they don't always land where you land on a particular argument. What are we supposed to do then? How are we going to engage it? And I think this is an important conversation. I really do. I think this is an important conversation to realize, let's just call the elephant out in the room. We're heading into an election year. This is a time when things kind of get heated. This is a time when emotions are on the rise, tension begins to increase. We know that we're heading into a season like that, and it only makes matters worse to realize that we really kind of live in a culture of outrage. It just seems like the tension, you can cut it with a knife out there. We have athletes refusing to meet with presidents, restaurants refusing to serve people because of their political beliefs. People are being spit on because of their alignment with a group of people. We even have students being punched in the face for what they stand for. We live in this culture of rage and outrage. How are we to engage this world? And I just want to say, as your pastor, as we head in this next year, I want to call us to something as a church, to be meaningful about a posture that I want us to take as we engage the world around us, as we engage the culture we live in. What I'm asking us to do is to engage with civility. I'm calling us to live with civility. And we're going to talk about a little bit today what civility is, because I think it's something we've sort of lost in our culture a little bit. We've lost a certain level of civility in our lives. We say, well, what is civility? Well, it's not that complicated. It's really just a formal politeness. It's showing courtesy towards others, treating them with dignity and respect. If I had to kind of summarize it, it's using your good manners. But you might be thinking, I don't have good manners, to which I say, get some. It's not that hard. Get some. I want us to engage this next year, really, not just this next year. I mean, if we're thinking about it, civility is a spiritual discipline. We should be engaging everyone who disagrees with us. We should be engaging confrontation and conflict always with a certain measure of civility. Jesus demonstrated that all the time. There were a lot of people that disagreed with Jesus, and yet he always engaged them in love. And so I want to just kind of highlight about 5 different things or so today and challenge us to these things in the next year. And so these are going to be your fill-ins as we follow along. I encourage you to fill these in, to take a look again later in the week, to be praying over them and asking God more and more to reveal to you, what does this mean to me in my life? What does this mean in my workplace, in my neighborhood, in my family? How do we engage civilly with other people? And so the first thing I'd want to remind us, if we're going to be civil with others, is this: people with different opinions aren't your enemy. That's an important one. People with different opinions aren't your enemy. We're not always going to agree. It's not going to happen. God has uniquely gifted each of us with the ability to see the world from our own perspective, from our own worldview. And that affects the lens through which we look. We're not always going to land in the same place. But what you have to remember is when someone disagrees with you, it is not an attack on who you are and your principles. It just means they didn't land where you landed. And one of the problems when someone disagrees is oftentimes we enter into that conversation with a zero-sum mindset or a scarcity mindset. You say, well, what's a zero-sum mindset? A zero-sum mindset sees that there's only two types of people in a debate. There are winners and there are losers, nothing else. And so it is my job to win this debate at all cost, because after all, you're the enemy. Zero sum is very limited. It doesn't really allow us to understand. There may be other parts of this conversation. It doesn't allow us to engage this person and try to understand them, their thoughts, their feelings, their past. How did they get to where they're at? It doesn't encourage relationship. And what we learn is the key to civility throughout this entire thing is relationship first. Build the relationship with someone. Find what you have in common rather than always what you have apart from each other. But when we approach this as a zero-sum mindset, which means there's only a winner, there's only a loser, our only motivation is to win. I have to win at all costs. A scarcity mindset, as we've talked about this a little bit before, a scarcity mindset sort of sees everything as one big pie, and it's my job to fight for as many pieces of that pie as I can get. It is my job to fight for the resources. It's my job to fight for everything within that pie because I have to get what I deserve, what belongs to me, rather than seeing that instead of just one pie, maybe there's many different pies. Maybe there's many different ways to look at this. Maybe there's other opportunities out there. Maybe we just need to look at this thing a little bit differently, take a step back and understand there's all sorts of opportunities here for us to find some common ground in understanding and do more than we ever thought we could do. But when we have a scarcity mindset, we only see it's one pie, there's only so much resources, and my job is to fight for every single one of those. And again, we find ourselves in opposition rather than cooperation with others. I encourage you, find those places, those common ground, engage those conversations rather than debate. Let's learn and build relationships with others. The next thing I would remind us of is this: acknowledge differences while maintaining respect. Maintain respect. As Christians, I would remind us there's two big covenants that we are held to. The first one is to love God with all our hearts. And the second one is we're called to love others the same. Those are our two primary driving forces as Christians. We love God and we love others. That's at the center of everything we do. And so when we gauge others out of love, one of the things we talk about as a staff is we always want to strive to protect someone's greatness. You say, what do you mean by that, protecting someone's greatness? What that means is it goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 1, the very first chapter of the Bible, of which we say that mankind, humankind, was created in God's image. We are God's unique and special creation. And because we are God's creation, created by Him, and that we are dearly loved, we too are called to respect the dignity of all people being the unique, beautiful creation of God. We're to always keep that in mind and treat them with respect and dignity in all that we do. Which means that some of the things we have to lose in our culture is what I call childish arguments. There's childish arguments out there. You say, what's a childish argument? What do you mean? Well, here's an example of a childish argument. It might look like this: I'm right, you're wrong, you're stupid. That would be a childish argument. And someone say, well, I don't know that I'd ever say that, but here's what I'd ask: have you ever thought it? Because, see, in this, you're not in cooperation with them. It's actually very condescending to them. But a lot of us approach that debate, a lot of us approach differences and conflict with that. I'm right, you're wrong, you're stupid. And it really doesn't help the conversation at all. But I think if I had to pick one childish argument that I have encountered the most, particularly in the last year, one that I've had to deal with personally, it's some version of this. If you disagree with me, you're a hater. That's the one that I've had to deal with the most in the last year. If you don't land where I land, you're hateful. If you don't believe everything I believe in, I even got this one once, you're Hitler. That one's brutal. It's a childish argument. I've had to deal with this even in my own family, working with relatives, constantly reminding them, listen, my love for you is unconditional. There's absolutely nothing you can do to step outside of my love. I will always love you. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to beg for it. You got it. I love each of you the same way because we're commanded to. I love you no matter what, but what I've had to remind people in my family is this. I love you, but that does not mean I affirm everything you do. And there's a big difference between loving and affirming. It is not unloving to draw a line and say, I'm not sure I agree with you on this. It is not unloving to have a set of beliefs, even if they're different than someone else. You are not hateful in that case. And I constantly just have to remind my family, I have to remind my friends of that. You are loved unconditionally. In fact, in many cases, I accept you for the decisions you've made and what you've done, but that still doesn't mean I affirm what you've done. And there's a huge difference between those two things. I encourage you to use that word, affirm. It is a good word to use with folks on that. I can love you unconditionally, but not affirm every decision you make, not affirm everything you've done. And there's a difference between those two things. My children can believe with all of their hearts that I should let them play with razor blades and hand grenades, but I'm not going to let them do it. And it doesn't mean I don't love them, and it doesn't mean I don't care for them. It just means that it's dangerous and it's going to hurt you. And for that reason, I cannot affirm or allow that behavior at this time. There's a difference between loving and affirming in our lives. Treat people with respect. Love them unconditionally. Because what you're going to find as we practice civility is this next important thing, and that's that civility requires humility. It does. Not everyone's going to accept your Christian principles, and not everybody should have to. We're all given free will. We're all given the ability to choose. And love demands that we not make everybody think the way we think. It's not our job, it's not my job to get everyone to think the way I think or believe what I believe. It is, however, if we go back to Genesis chapter 1 and our understanding as the reflection of God, it is our job to reflect the light of God into the darkness of the world so that when other people see us, they see the love of God and they know that there is hope and healing. They know that there is another voice, there is another way. They can see through our humility and through our love and through us reaching out to others, they can see that there is another way, that there is hope through Jesus Christ. It is our job to shine the light of Jesus throughout the world that we live in, but it's not our job to make them who we are, to force them who we are. Our job is to show people Jesus, and there's a difference. Next thing I'd remind us of, and this one's a little harder, your ideology can be an idol. This one's a little harder. Let me put it this way. I know some Christians that are more interested in being Republicans than they are Christians. And I know that's hard. And I want to remind you, Jesus was not a Republican. He was not a Democrat either. Wasn't libertarian. He wasn't any of those things. Jesus is only your king. He is the Lord on high. And anything that gets in the way of our worship of him becomes an idol. We are called to serve him. But when we allow politics and when we allow political parties to define who we are, rather than Christ, they become an idol. And we must be careful of that, because Jesus said, you are not of this world. You are kingdom people. When we make a decision to follow Jesus, we die to the world and its ways, and we join Christ's kingdom movement to where he is king. And when we vote, we're not supposed to go vote by any other thing except what would Jesus do. Jesus is my king. And so when we go to vote, it's not about what political party you're about. You are kingdom people. Vote as the people of God. We are not defined by politics. We are defined by Jesus. And that can be hard. And in this enraged culture, that might be a unique idea to you. But I would constantly ask, and let me ask this question. Who do you brag about more? What do you talk about more? Politics or Jesus? Ask yourself that in your life. The last thing I'd remind us is this. A call for civility is not a lack of conviction. Civility is not compromising what you believe in. I'm not asking you to lower the bar here. What I am saying is civility is a posture. That's what we've been talking about. Civility is a posture first and foremost of love. Civility is a posture that focuses on the relationship first. Finding those bridges that we have in common and focusing on those things that we share before only focusing on what our differences are. We're all going to have differences. There's always going to be conflicts. But there's so much we have in common. However, the thing that we always have to keep in mind as we engage people civilly, as we dialogue with them, is something that Paul would remind us, and he was reminding the church in Corinth. In 1 Corinthians 13:1, he said, and maybe you've probably come across this at a wedding before. He said, if I speak in the tongues of men or angels, but I do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. What's Paul saying here? What he's saying is this. If I speak but I don't have love, I'm just noise. And nobody listens to noise. And nobody wants noise. May our conversations be built on love. May we protect people's greatness, their dignity, live with respect, use our good manners in all that we do. I say this constantly, and I believe it absolutely. How you say something is almost always more important than what you say. Because if you don't say it in love, you're just noise. Nobody's going to hear it. Ask yourself in life, in your conversations at work, at home, are your words loving or are they noise? Which gets us to our so what moment. I was reminded not too long ago, just sitting there, how can this person think so differently about Jesus? How can they have such different views about Jesus than I do? I had just read their article. Couldn't disagree with it more. And the hard part is this was a friend of mine. It's somebody I knew, somebody I'd worked with before. And yet, when I read his article, I'm like, where in the world did you come up with these conclusions? How'd you even get here? We like to say he's playing in left field. And I'm like, no, he's not playing in left field. He's in another field playing another game altogether, man. He missed the boat. And the problem is I read it right before I went to bed. So guess what I did for the next hour as I sat there in bed? I fumed over it, just playing it back and forth in my head. Have you ever done that before? Am I the only fool who's done that mistake? But then I remember taking a step back and thinking for a minute, because I knew him well. And I thought, you know what? If he was standing with me here on stage, we would both look at you and say, without any reservation, Jesus Christ is the hope for the world. We would both look at you without any question and say, he is the way. Jesus is the truth. Jesus is the life. No man comes to the Father except by him. We hold that in common. And in a world that so desperately just needs to be introduced to Jesus, what's more important? Our differences or the truth of the gospel that can change lives? And so I was reminded of what we teach in our Discover Partnership class. Some of you have taken that class before, and so this will be review, but I think we need to be reminded of things sometimes. For some, you may see this later, but I think it's so important. One of the things we teach in the class is this. We'll say in essentials we have unity, but in non-essentials we have freedom. But what we will end with always is this. In all issues, we show love. Always. We will posture ourselves in love. We will be civil. And so what do you think, gang? The next year? Do you think that's something we can be aware of? Something that can be on our minds as we engage this election season, as we engage people even in our own lives that just see things differently than we do? Can we agree to say, listen, I believe that what I believe in is important, but I want to engage you civilly. I want to show respect, protect your dignity, and in all things, may we be loving. So that when other people see this unique love that the world desperately needs to see, y'all, when they see that love in you, they say, there's something different about you, something I need. And now the door is open. And you say, you know what it is? It is only Jesus. And he can transform your life because he is love. May that be what people see when they see us different in this election season. Let's pray.